in various countries, such as China, the United Arab Emirates, but also other European countries. I was working also in other parts of the Far and the Middle East. So therefore, I have, again, quite a few experiences in living and working under different political conditions, like, for example, in a feudal autocracy like in Dubai, or kind of capitalist communist system like China, or in a different way in Russia. So in other words, if I would balance this, then I would say, if you speak about global culture, then the word global, first of all, probably refers to a kind of understanding of what is universal, what we share all together, what we have in common across the globe, regardless where we live and where we come from. So global means something overall, all-inclusive, encompassing, maybe even trespassing borders, and therefore is something which is sometimes hard to grasp, but at the same time always to some extent present. We feel it, it's there, while we are somewhere, while we are moving from one place to another. Therefore, I think if we speak about culture, and not about arts, but about culture, which is a larger context where art is only a part of, and we speak also about traditions, maybe even about religion, about education, about identity, about the social context. And I would say that ethics or moral aspects and aesthetical values, on the other hand, they are only two elements of the discourse. I would say culture is not that kind of flat, two-dimensional object with two criteria, aesthetics and ethics. I do think that both of them are important, but there's much more to it. And if you want to position yourself in this field of global culture, you have to look at all these different layers and dimensions. So next to ethics or aesthetics, I believe that you have also referred to the social situation, the political situation, maybe even the technical situation in a country or in an environment or in a relationship to somebody. Maybe it is important to think about identities. Maybe it's important to think about certain aspects of freedom or restricted freedom, etc. So what I want to say is that culture is a multi-dimensional space, and you try, as an actor in the field of culture, try to position yourself, considering many of these layers, sometimes maybe not even being aware of all of these layers, but these layers may have an influence on your activities and on your relationships and on your position too. However, I do think that it matters where you come from, and that it matters where you are working. For example, as I mentioned, I'm coming from East Germany, a country which ceased to exist in the meantime 26 years ago. I live today in Western countries such as Switzerland and the United Kingdom. And I have to say, I have embraced freedom of speech and expression. I have embraced many Western values, and I know that they have formed and shaped mostly my personal, also cultural identity, including also faith, including ethical convictions, etc. So therefore, when I'm traveling, for example, to the Middle East, when I'm traveling to China, I'm not turning into a Bedouin of the desert of the Arabian Peninsula. I'm not turning into a Chinese person, of course. I'm remaining what I am. I'm a Westerner with a certain specific experience from another political system. So when I'm positioning myself in working in other countries, or even working in an international environment like today in our online seminar, I'm representing a certain set of values which are probably mostly created in the Western Hemisphere. But at the same time, I'm aware that I'm talking to people, that I'm maybe working in an environment, not in the same way being formed by those elements or those aspects or values. So therefore, I have always to consider that there might be a gap, there might be a difference. And I think culture is indeed a tool to always measure differences, to make them visible. And I think that's one of the most exciting aspects of working in the culture sphere, that culture works in each place differently. And even if we have things in common and are able to share them, we have at the same time to also respect that culture differences are there, and we have to not try to convince the other side always about that our values are higher or higher regarded or more important than theirs. I think there should be an on-par communication where the other side is respected the same way as we respect ourselves. However, of course, given the fact that I believe in democracy, I believe in participation, I believe in many Western values, I cannot share the values of dictatorships. So therefore, even if I encounter people representing and proactively defending other political systems, I would probably also start discourses about values, because I think this is a very important form of exchange also in the field of culture and arts. So, so far for the beginning. Now I see here a second question. I would like to know, what is the meaning of a case study? What do you mean with this term? Right. The CCAA is indeed considered a case study, and the CCAA is indeed a very particular case I would like to elaborate on. As you have seen in our first chapter this week, I was trying to first open the picture up a bit larger and speak about how our cultural landscape worldwide has changed during the last 25 years in particular, after the law of borders and the possibility of much more exchange and mobility across the globe, with people having also the technological means to exchange in a way which is unprecedented, was unprecedented to now. So in other words, this transformation of the culture landscape worldwide, by the fact that people are much closer to each other, have much more possibility, many more possibilities to exchange with each other, has created a new form of culture, which we would call probably global culture. So we are in an era of cultural globalization. At the same time, of course, we know that culture is something local, is something specifically related to people's local identities, roots. For example, our language is certainly not global, except maybe the English language, which is used as a means of communication between the people worldwide. But most of the other languages are not considered global, even if they are spoken in several languages, like Spanish or, for example, French or German. So that's why we have all of us our particular identities. And some of you, for example, coming from certain countries, you may, I saw this already, there is somebody coming from Switzerland but living in Hong Kong. So while living in Hong Kong, you probably feel also that you still remain a Swiss person with your Swiss identity, with your Swiss cultural, let's say, baggage. And therefore, there is this double-bound identity, or double-bound experience of a local cultural identity within, let's say, a bubble of global culture. Now, I think there are countries where the process of cultural globalization started early, and other countries where it started much later. For example, the United States were always very strong in disseminating their cultural products and content abroad, as we know, through Hollywood, other means of communication. Whereas other countries like China, on the opposite side, were secluded for a long time and isolated and disconnected from this kind of global bubble of culture I had mentioned before. In the meantime, also this economic giant China has woken up and become a cultural giant. And if you look at the evolution of culture in China over the last 30, 40 years, and now I'm not speaking exclusively about art, but at the same time about film or literature or other aspects, you would see that in the very beginning, after the end of the Cultural Revolution in 1976, Mao's death and the opening up of the Chinese society, that in the very beginning, during the first 10, maybe even 20 years, China, or even 25 years, China was rather trying to work out and come to terms with its own identity. After a long period of seclusion and isolation, China tried to understand itself better, also through art and culture. And I think, for example, contemporary art played a very instrumental role in this kind of self-development, creation of self-awareness and reformation of the Chinese identity. In the meantime, I would say over the course of the last 5 to 10 years, you can see that Chinese artists, regardless if they're filmmakers or visual artists or theater people, more and more understand themselves as part of a worldwide existing global context. Why? Because they have become part of it. They have started communicating with the rest of the world. They have started to position themselves within the context of global art, of global cinema, of global performing arts, etc., global music, whatsoever. So you can see that China maybe arrived late in the discourse of global culture, but it arrived finally and now has become a very important driving force in the development of new expressions, of new artwork in this context of global art. So many Chinese artists today would never, not anymore consider themselves so much Chinese, and would probably disagree that you can explain their work exclusively with the fact that they are Chinese. They would at the same time say most of the American or, let's say, Swiss artists, you would neither nail down by their own national identity. It doesn't work this way anymore. We have become part of a global discourse, of a global community of artists, and of global culture. So this process is very exciting because I think many emerging countries have to go through this transformation. And what can happen, of course, is that in the end, the locality or the localism of art and culture disappears. And I think that would be very tricky and very difficult, or very negative, because art and culture is all also about diversity, about varieties. And therefore, I think even if a country, a nation, people from a country connect to the global discourse, at the same time it is important to ensure that they still have the possibility to express themselves in their specific way, with their background, with their identity. And I think, therefore, it's very important to create this kind of link. The CCAA is, for, well, let's say Chinese contemporary art is for me an exclusive possibility of understanding how this process of, on the one hand, liberating a nation from its disconnection culturally and positioning itself between global and local, between national and international, between the generations, between politics and art, between aesthetics and ethics, between all these aspects I had mentioned before. That's actually a very, very interesting tool to understand this. So we have chosen this subject in order to show something larger. A case study is a study which allows to understand aspects better we haven't understood so far, and they stand for a larger context and not only for themselves. So the evolution of the Chinese contemporary art speaks about, at the same time, how the process of cultural globalization evolves. The next question I got from Nicola. what is the relationship between art, ethics, and politics, and how might this operate in a global world? I think there is no ultimate answer to this, because, as I mentioned before, even if you try to keep your position as somebody who is coming from somewhere with a specific set of identity, of values, you still have always to adjust yourself in this dynamics of, let's say, a place. In the first chapter, I have introduced to you the situation of Dubai. If you look, for example, at Dubai, only 7% of the people of Dubai today are local people, are Arabs from the United Arab Emirates or Emiratis. The rest of them, more than 90% of the population of Dubai, are people coming literally from all over the world. So if you speak about cultural identity in such a place, it's a very tricky thing, because the people come from everywhere, have different religious backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, different social layers, different social walks of life. So therefore, it's pretty difficult to find here the common denominator as one single identity. I think it doesn't really exist. So therefore, you have to, if you work, for example, in a place like Berlin, then you work afterwards in a place like Dubai, you have to readjust also the relationship between art, ethics, and politics. This is, I think, a very important point. As I said before, there are a few, I would say, priorities. Freedom of speech is for art something I would believe very important. And you cannot really imagine let's say, in the long term at least, the development of culture and arts without such a thing. But that's my conviction. I know, and I encounter very often today in particular Asian countries, that there is a different notion. There's much more, there's anyway, generally speaking, a different understanding of individuality, for example. We would always say that art is an expression of an individual. And we may do something for the rest of the world or the rest of our society, and it's becoming something collective, but it starts as something very personal, something very individual in the beginning. It's not the same necessarily everywhere. People would say in some countries in Southeast Asia, for example, or in Africa, or probably also where I'm not so familiar with, but I assume so, also in South America, many people would say art has to serve a certain function, like maybe faith. Maybe even local custom, popular art and culture, etc. So therefore, there are different notions of what is art for and what is art about. And that's why wherever you go, you have to sort of adjust this, and not losing your own convictions, of course. So that's why I have to say again, if you ask the question how this operates, then I would say it can only function in a form of a dialogue or multilogue where everybody accepts that there are differences, and at the same time culture is a means to overcome those differences without destroying the other identities. So Renaud puts a question here, so you think global culture will destruct local culture? It's a very good point, certainly, because I think many people are scared of cultural globalization, because in fact cultural globalization does destroy things. There's no question about this. I have already brought up some examples in my course, speaking, for example, about Dubai, where you can see that the Bedouin culture is, of course, under an enormous threat, given the fact that so many people otherwise come from all over the world. On the one hand, you can say that's great, of course, because if people manage to live freely and peacefully together with different religious backgrounds, with different political backgrounds, coming from so different walks of life, in particular an environment like Dubai, and I want to quickly share with you what's the situation like in Dubai today. Let me just quickly try to share my screen with you to give you an impression of what I'm talking about. Now you should see the map of Dubai. And as you can see, Dubai is surrounded by countries like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen. Many of these countries are infamous for fundamentalism, political radicalism, and instability. So when you look at this, and here at the same time, there is a place like Dubai where people live together peacefully with Sunnite and Shiite faith fighting each other in the neighborhood, with Western values and with maybe coming from China, Russia, or from the Philippines, then I think this deserves some respect, apart from the fact that obviously at the same time not all human rights are fully accepted in Dubai. So what I want to say is that in such a place, on the one hand, a certain type of cosmopolitanism has been achieved, but at the same time, the local population may feel overwhelmed by this and may feel under pressure. So that's why how to protect also local customs, local language. For example, in Dubai, most of the people are forced to speak more or less constantly English. Also, children learn first and foremost most of the content at school in English instead of their own language. So that's why how to protect, how to preserve local customs, local culture, it's a very important point. And I think cultural globalization can become only something successful if we don't forget about this. I'm not only speaking here about emerging countries, because I think it matters the same way in Western countries too, where we also think that we have already abandoned most of our cultural heritage. We are not so keen to understand it anymore, although maybe it was actually the main driving force having formed our national identity. So in other words, we have as cultural players a very high responsibility on balancing between global and local. Another question from Nicola: should we adopt different criteria for are both? There are local and universal criteria. And again, I think they shouldn't be put in a way that they are too rigid, because otherwise we would constantly with reality when we have to apply them. On the one hand, I do believe that there are some universal rights and some universal values most of the people on Earth would probably share. And I have said already before that it's pretty difficult to define them because it is so related to the local situation. But I think, for example, that art and culture is something which on the one hand shows a specific identity and therefore a difference between me and the other, but at the same time is a mean to explain yourself in your difference, in your otherness to the others, and make yourself also part of a larger content, community, whatever you call it. I think that's very important, that we really understand that culture is a possibility to understand or to learn from otherness. I think this is something which is shared. The reason why people express themselves through culture and art is that they want to share, they want to show their specific individuality or identity to people who don't share this necessarily or who are not aware of this. On the other hand, I do think that there are also many local criteria which are rather related to the bonds you have to a certain, let's say, solidarity. Different forms of solidarities like gender, nation, culture, religion, a social layer. And unfortunately, many wars were and are fought in the name of those solidarities, of religion, of a nation, etc. So therefore, I think the differences between those solidarities matter a lot if it comes to culture and art. And we have to respect that, for example, the French culture in many ways is different from the German culture, despite the fact that we are so historically and geographically close to each other. And this is also, I have to say again, probably an extraordinary wealth, in particular of the continent of Europe, that such a diversity has been created. And we, despite all the wars, were able to protect and to preserve this diversity. So altogether, I would say it is a quite important aspect to always distinguish between being on a certain place, regarding and respecting its local situation, and at the same time looking at the world in general and trying to understand your position within the larger global context. I just can speak about my personal experience in China, for example. China is certainly a country with an enormous, long cultural tradition, 5,000 years of history. And you feel it if you go to China, that you are in a very old, very mature, almost overwhelmingly rich culture. At the same time, this country underwent tremendous catastrophes and transformations in the course of the last 100 years. Many things have been destroyed. Many things have been wiped out. Of empire, also foreign occupation and influences from both colonial powers from Europe, but also Japan. Then communism, a concept which was conceived in the West and imposed on the Chinese traditional Confucianist culture. So in many ways, you can see that the Chinese identity has been distorted and confused within the last 100 years or so. And even now, you see that with opening up to a hedonist, consumerist society, which the West has to offer as an alternative, obviously, to the communist system, many people feel there's an enormous tension between their traditions and their roots, their identity, and the shopping malls of all the cities of China, which are sort of seemingly the future existence of also the Chinese individual. So in many ways, I think China is a country where you can really see it works like a laboratory between these two elements, a very mature, very old culture, and at the same time very much under pressure through global changes, through a global impact, and at the same time also because of a growing global responsibility and importance the people in China feel too. Is it because of pollution? Is it because of its sheer size of population? Is it because of its economic power? And finally, is it because of its cultural power? Because China is the largest cultural space in the world. So therefore, you can imagine that sooner or later, China may play a similar role in culture and art as it does already in the economy. And therefore, it's so important and interesting to study it. So there is another question from Renato, I think. Let me read it up to. Something happened here. Okay, I think I can read it anyway. When we speak about global culture, is this very Western influenced? How do you see the Asian Chinese influence of our Western cultures? When we speak about global culture, is this very okay? Yes, I think again what we can observe today is that from my perspective, there is a really strong, I mean, first of all, you could say that global, or the culture of globalization in general, is mainly driven by Western powers, in particular maybe the United States. At least the way how we understand globalization today, it has started after 1945, in a moment where the world politics, the world map in politics has been redesigned with the collapse not only of Germany and the Nazi powers and the totalitarianism in Central Europe and in Japan, but at the same time also with the collapse of the colonial powers of the British Empire, France, and to some extent earlier already Spain and Portugal and the Netherlands. So while the world was really redesigned and created like two superpowers, America and the USSR, this was not only a Cold War in terms of politics, military, maybe economy, but it was also a cultural war. It was indeed also a war about the supremacy in cultural terms. So therefore, this enormously successful and eloquent way of promoting the values of the United States, in particular of America, to the rest of the world through tools like Hollywood, but also, you like it or not, McDonald's, or also the Bill of Rights of the US. Those elements were extremely powerful and worked almost everywhere in the world, and created a kind of notion of what is the freedom of the Western world all about, regardless what the reality looked like. So even in abandoned camps of Afghan mujahideens, you may have found images, photos, I know stories, showing Leonardo DiCaprio in the Titanic movie as a picture somewhere, or a poster somewhere in the middle of nowhere of the so-called fundamentalist Muslim world. So in other words, the Western, in particular American culture, was able to really disseminate itself all over the place and to penetrate almost everywhere, and created this kind of enormous influence almost everywhere on what is great, so-called great popular culture. Music was, of course, part of it as well. And the Western European countries played their role in it, certainly too. But I think in the meantime, there is a shift. You can really feel that while over, let's say, 50, 60 years, there was this kind of Western predominant influence on the rest of the world, shaping an understanding of what is a successful culture and artistic expression. But I do believe that in the next decades, we will see that there is a shift happening in a similar way it happened already in the economy, which means that I do believe that not only Chinese, but also Indian, Southern Asian, South American creators of art and culture will become much more not only part of the global discourse and the global display, but they may become the driving forces of new developments. I do believe that these countries have a lot of creative people, and sometimes today more means because they are growing. They have today sometimes more capital, human capital, but also financial capital. They are about to build more institutions, organizations of culture and arts, museums, theaters, etc. And although in the very beginning some of these projects collapse, or it turns out that they are not well conceived, but over a longer period, and culture is nothing you can really picture only in a short period of, say, 10 years, but let's say within this century, I do believe we will observe a similar shift also in culture and arts, and a much higher importance of emerging countries in the global discourse, as we observed it already in the economy and also in the political discussions. Okay, any other questions? So I'm looking this up here and I can't find any, neither in the chat room. So I would say we don't need to necessarily exhaust the time of 60 minutes if you feel that we have covered what we wanted to, or you wanted to get to know today in 45 minutes, then it's perfect too. So then I would call it a day and wrap it up. First of all, I have to thank all of you that you spent some time on a Sunday, and for some of you it's already pretty late or still very early the day. I have already mentioned that there is planned a second encounter with one of our speakers. And in the very end, I would like to remind you on that. Let me check quickly if I have it somewhere. No, that's not the one I wanted. Renato, I think here I need your help. If you wouldn't mind speaking to me quickly, because I would like to point out when the next two encounters are planned.
So we have two other online meetings, one with Uli Sigg that happens in chapter 5 on May 12th at 2 o'clock Central European summer time, and third one is with.
Sorry to interrupt. So this is not a Sunday. It's a Thursday, right. Thursday, May 12th. But it would be the same day, time of the day. Is that correct?
It will be the same time of the day, exactly. So
good.
Uli Sigg will be on site and answer the questions of you in the same way you could ask it here in this online meeting. And then we have a third one with Kathleen Bühler. She's the curator of the Chinese Whispers exhibition at the Kunstmuseum Bern in Switzerland. And this online meeting takes place on Sunday, May 22nd from 5:30 till 6:30 Central European summertime.
All right. Thank you very much, Renato. You will find it anyway later on the website of the CCAA at the university. And you will also have further on the possibility to put more questions. I saw that you are very active already in developing a journal and share it also with others. I find this very intriguing. It shows that we are obviously speaking about relevant subjects among people who are very keen and curious. And I think this is something very much to also develop further. And I'm looking forward to it, and will be staying also a part of this conversation. Have otherwise a nice Sunday. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night to all of you, and be in touch soon again. Bye-bye.